Kalen stood at the center of the shifting stone arena, weaponless and bleeding, while the crowd's laughter died into a deafening silence. He dodged the lightning with the precision of a man who could see the future. High above, the Sovereign's eyes narrowed, her psychic pressure coiling like a physical weight around the Terran's throat. If you've ever felt like the smallest person in a room full of giants, you'll want to see how this ends. Subscribe to join our journey through the stars. Now, let's see how Kalen found himself in the crosshairs of gods. A week ago, the hardest decision Kalen had faced was whether to skip breakfast. He had spent that morning polishing his standard-issue chronolink watch, the mechanical ticking a rhythmic comfort against the sterile hum of the diplomatic transport. It was a relic of Earth, simple and unaugmented, much like the man currently standing at the end of a line of apex predators. The grand spire of Ethelgard was a cathedral of light and ego. To Kalen's left stood a Thraxian warrior, for arms corded with bioelectric muscle that crackled whenever he shifted. To his right, a psionic adept from the Veil hovered inches off the floor, eyes glowing with the hijacked power of a dying star. They were the hegemony's finest genetic masterpieces designed for the choosing ceremony. Sovereign Valerius moved through the hall not with steps, but with a predatory grace that suggested the floor was merely humoring her weight. She paused before each champion, her mind brushing against theirs in a silent exchange of Tier 1 combat data and ancestral lineage. When she reached Kalen, she didn't even slow down. The hegemony nobles in the tiered galleries didn't hide their amusement. Their sneers were as sharp as the crystalline pillars surrounding them. To them, the Terran was a rounding error in a galaxy of constants, which meant the readings were wrong. Seraphina, the Sovereign's heir and the one destined to name the High Champion, did not follow her mother's path. She ignored the Thraxian's display of strength and the Adept's shimmering aura. Instead, she stopped before the plain man in the charcoal suit. She looked at his hands, steady and unenhanced, and then at the small, ticking watch on his wrist. "I chose the only one in this room who knows how to think," Seraphina said, her voice cutting through the telepathic chatter of the court. Power without wisdom eventually consumes itself. The silence that followed was brittle. Then the uproar began. The Sovereign turned, her face a mask of cold fury as she decreed that the choice would only be honored if the soft skin survived the 7 trials of honor, lethal tests that had claimed the lives of literal demigods. Later that evening, in the starlit gardens where the air smelled of ozone and ancient jasmine, Seraphina found Kalen. He was sitting on a stone bench, his thumb tracing the glass face of his watch. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a man counting the seconds he had left. What happens when a rigid tradition meets an unpredictable mind? Join us as we uncover the secrets of the hegemony. She sat beside him, the light of 3 moons reflecting in her silver eyes. She explained that the hegemony had become a closed loop of predictable strength. They were so obsessed with raw output that they had forgotten how to observe. "You don't have their fire, Kalen," she whispered, "but you have a perspective they can't even simulate." The first trial was a blur of kinetic energy and gravity wells, but the second, the trial of unity, was where the laughter truly died. Kalen stood between the Thraxian and the psionic adept, both of whom were attempting to blast through a sentient crystalline wall with raw force. Every strike only made the barrier thicker, absorbing their bioelectricity and psychic fire like a sponge. Kalen didn't swing a fist. He watched the way the crystals pulsed, noticing the fraction of a second where the glow faded after an impact. He realized the wall wasn't a door. It was a rhythmic lock. "Stop hitting it," Kalen shouted, his voice cracking against the boom of the Thraxian's 4-armed assault. "You're feeding it. We have to hit the resonance points together on the low beat." They ignored him until the Thraxian's arm snapped under the recoil of his own strength. Desperate, the giants finally listened to the mirror. Under Kalen's direction, they synchronized their remaining power into a single, timed pulse. The wall didn't shatter. It simply dissolved, recognizing a frequency it couldn't consume. But that was nothing compared to the trial of verity. And now, back in that shifting stone arena, the bridge between the physical and the metaphysical had collapsed. The lightning Kalen had dodged wasn't weather. It was the sovereign's own neural synapses firing into the physical realm. He felt her inside his mind, a cold tide pulling at his memories. She dragged up every moment he'd felt like a diplomatic formality. Every instance where he'd been the smallest man in the room. The sovereign spoke through the air itself, her voice a thunderclap. "You are a flicker of dust in a storm of stars. Why do you not kneel?" Kalen gasped for air, his fingers finding the familiar, cold metal of the watch in his pocket. He didn't try to push her out with mental shields he didn't possess. Instead, he leaned into the fear. He let the insecurity wash over him until he could feel its edges. "I'm terrified," Kalen choked out, looking directly into the shimmering void where the sovereign watched. "And that's why I'm more dangerous than you. You've forgotten what it's like to have something to lose. My courage exists because of my fear, not in spite of it." The psychic labyrinth shattered. The sovereign recoiled, her presence snapping back to her throne as the arena returned to solid, unmoving stone. Silence fell over the spire, heavier than any gravity well. "Character and wisdom," the sovereign finally whispered, her voice carrying a newfound edge of genuine caution, "are dangerous new forms of power." Seraphina stepped down from the dais, her hand finding Kalen's. She didn't look at him as a pet or a curiosity, but as a catalyst. The nobles who had mocked him now looked away, unable to meet the gaze of the man who had looked into the sovereign's mind and said no. Kalen reached into his pocket and pulled out the old watch. The glass was cracked from the pressure of the trials, and the ticking was a little slower than before, but it hadn't stopped. He gripped the metal firmly, no longer checking the time to see how much he had left, but to mark the moment the empire began to change. What would you sacrifice to prove that your perspective matters in a world that tries to ignore you? We'll be back tomorrow with another chronicle from the edge of the galaxy.